Hey everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I thought I'd be doing a video on a January through March reading wrap-up. I only made my channel very recently, so I did not post to this sooner. I hope I can make reading wrap-ups a more regular feature on my channel. I don't know if monthly will be feasible with the way my life is going on right now. My reading pace is kind of slowed down, but at least every few months to keep you guys up to date with what I'm reading and help me make progress. So I'm going to be looking at my phone throughout this to check my Goodreads account and just remember what I've read, who the authors are, and everything. These are in no particular order. They're not in the order that I've read them so far, but I'm going to talk about all of them anyway. So first up is the book The Lodge by Chris Koppel. So this one I got from NetGalley. It's a thriller mystery. It takes place, I think, in Scotland, if I remember correctly. I sometimes get confused between Scotland and Northern England. Please, no one fight me on that. The main character is a cop who gets a call right around Christmas time that there has been an accident at a remote hunting lodge and one of the guests is dead. So he makes his way up to this lodge and the plot kind of goes from there. It's a really good book. There are twists and turns that I didn't see coming. It's also fun. There's a supernatural element to it. I don't want to spoil anything for those of you that haven't read it, but I'm not someone who's usually into thrillers or mysteries, but I just thought this was a really good, fun twist on that kind of book. So I would recommend it. After that, I listened to Disney War as an audiobook. Shout out to Libby, where I got it for free through my local library. This book is by James B. Stewart. It tells the kind of crazy inner happenings of Disney as a business back in the golden age of Disney, like 80s, 90s, that I did not know existed. I like Disney. I would say I know more about Disney than the average person, but I don't identify as like a Disney person the way some people do. But it was just crazy to hear about the drama, the infighting, the business acquisitions, and just Disney as a company. And that's the main part of the story, but then this all happens along the backdrop of like the animated movies that most people know and love. And so that was really interesting. It's a very long book. I think it's 28 hours worth of audio, which is a lot, obviously. But I was able to listen to it while working and I really enjoyed it. I'd recommend you read it if you like that sort of thing. If you're interested in the inner workings of companies, you just like drama, anything like that, I would recommend it. I'd also recommend listening to it on 2x speed, which is what I did, but your taste may vary. Next up is a short story. So I read the short story Galetea by Madeline Miller. And Madeline Miller is one of my favorite authors. The Song of Achilles is my favorite book. Circe is another one of my favorite books. I love anything mythology inspired. And I particularly love like feminist or modern myth retellings. And so this is that. If you know the story of Galetea and Pygmalion, this is that story, but it's really got feminist values, and you see the story from her perspective because the Greek myth kind of takes the male Pygmalion perspective and what it would be like to be Galetea. And if you don't know the story of Pygmalion and Galetea, Pygmalion is a sculptor and he makes a sculpture of a woman that he makes so beautiful he falls in love with it. And Aphrodite blesses him and makes the statue come alive, and that female statue is Galetea. And this is sort of after that story happens, like what their life together is like. And it is only a short story, so it's a very quick read, but highly recommend. I also have to give a shout out to Chelsea on Goodreads. I don't know Chelsea, and this review is from 4 years ago, but I will link her review down in the video description. But she gave it 4 stars, and the text of her review just reads, "Haunting and brutal. Madeline Miller owns my mythology-loving ass," and that is 100% how I feel, so perfect description, Chelsea. Next up, following in a similar theme, I read The Silence of the Girls, which is another feminist female myth retelling. This one's about the Trojan War, and this one follows the main character of Briseis. I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's been a few years since I took classical mythology. Pretty sure it's Briseis though. And she is one of the women who comes from the Trojan side, who is captured before the Greeks take the city of Troy. They loot some other cities and villages and towns around the main capital area, and she is one of the women that's taken, and she is claimed by Achilles to be one of his slave women. And it's a very hard story, a very brutal story. It's not a feel-good story. If you know her story from mythology, you'll know what I mean by that. But it's just so good. I love anything, again, that's like a feminist mythology retelling. It's so good. I highly recommend it. I also have read some of Pat Barker's work before. She has done some World War I books that are so good. I also love World War I. That's my favorite historical time period, and any story set in World War I immediately has my attention. So seeing that she did one of these kind of feminist mythology retellings, immediately had that on my TBR, checked it out from the library, and bumped it up to #1 on my list. I hear she's coming out with a sequel to it, or maybe sequel's not the right word. She's coming out with another book that's in a very similar vein, and I want to read that 100%. Next up is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I know that this book is on everybody's list. I know that everybody in the booktube community pretty much has read this book by now, but it is so good. I would highly recommend you picking it up. It's I would call it an easy read just because you get so hooked in the story. And if you're somebody who enjoys the characters in a story more than the other plot elements, this will really hook you because the characters are all very captivating. So the format of this one is different. I don't know if there's a particular word for a book that is this way, sort of like an epistolary novel, but it's not letters back and forth. It's an interview. The book is fiction, but the book format is like it's an interview with this band, and it's really good. It's inspired by the true life story of Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac. So if you love the music scene from back then, if you just really love Stevie Nicks and or Fleetwood Mac, if you just love really interesting female characters, I would say definitely pick this up. It's so good. I'm sure you've seen it recommended a million times by other booktubers, but highly recommend. Next up, this is another one that's on so many booktube channels. It's Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. I hated this book. I hated this book so much. I made an entire blog post just ranting about how much I hated this book. Now I'm a little more removed from reading it, and so my feelings aren't as strong, but I did really hate this book. The premise of this book is that Eleanor is the main character, and she lives in Scotland, and she's, I think, an administrative assistant for a company, and she's like 30, and she lives a really sad life. You're just supposed to pity her for this sad, kind of pathetic life. No one likes her. She doesn't have any friends. She doesn't have any family, but she's just content to live this way. And you're supposed to think that she's gonna learn and grow and change as a person and become content with her life for real and, you know, form healthy relationships and stuff. But she's just a horrible person through the whole book. So many sections of it come off like she comes off like she's supposed to be a neurodivergent character, and a lot of people specifically say autistic. It's never specified that she is, and in fact I think the author has explicitly said that Eleanor is not supposed to be autistic in interviews, but she just comes off very strangely, and it could be poor character writing on the author's part. The author just seems to attribute it to trauma, but the ways that Eleanor behaves aren't very consistent with people who've experienced trauma. Eleanor's certainly been traumatized as a character throughout the book, but that doesn't seem to account for the main thing she experiences throughout the book, which is really weird, and I feel like you won't know what I'm talking about. But the individual interactions she has are so stilted and painful. Every interaction she has with another character is so stilted and painful that other characters make fun of her to her face, and she doesn't even know it. And she's just also not a good person. Like, one of the main events in the beginning of the book is that a man from her company who works in the IT department one day is walking out of the building with her, and as they're walking down the sidewalk, they see an old man collapsed on the ground, and he immediately is concerned. He runs over, is like, oh my god, we gotta help this man, like, call 911. And her response is that she doesn't want to help this elderly man who's unconscious on the sidewalk because she told herself she had to go grocery shopping after work, and so for some reason that's more important than helping this man on the sidewalk who's unconscious and could be dying and is like in his 80s. So she's just not a good person. She's not a likable person. You don't really understand her motives for being a bad character, and to me she doesn't really get redeemed throughout the book. Like, she eventually makes friends somewhat and changes, but like it's not really shown how she changes. It's sort of just like at the big crisis point of the book she just changes after that, and I as a reader wasn't invested in her character up until then because I hated it, and so I didn't feel like it was rewarding to watch her change and grow as a person because I just hated her character so much. There's one particular passage from this book that I just hated so much, and if you have read it, you might remember the scene I'm talking about. If you haven't, I quote it in my Goodreads review on it. I quote it on my blog. I'm sure other people have quoted it because it's so ridiculous. It's when Eleanor goes to get a bikini wax because she's stalking a random musician that she's never met or talked to, but she thinks he's attractive, and so she's convinced that they're gonna start dating and get married and have a life together. She doesn't know this man, and yet she decides she's gonna get a bikini wax for him because in her mind, just to be a desirable woman, you need a bikini wax, and so she's gonna go get a bikini wax to be a desirable woman. This is an example of like her motivations and thought processes not really making sense to people. So basically she gets a bikini wax, she shows up to the waxing salon, doesn't know what goes into a bikini wax, doesn't know that there are different types of bikini wax you can get, I don't know if everybody watching this video knows that, but the book makes it clear that there are multiple kinds you can get. And she chooses one at random, just based on the name, not knowing what it actually is, and then is mad that the waxer waxed her. And she claims that the musician that she's in love with is now going to think that she's a child, and she is insulted by the waxer because this is a clear sign that the waxer thinks the musician is a pedophile, and that just doesn't make any sense. That just doesn't make any sense at all. I don't think any person, whether or not they've experienced trauma in their life, would make that connection, because it's not a logical one to assume. It's weird things to lump together. Don't recommend. Not the weirdest part of the book, but it's up there, and that's definitely the most cringy interaction she has with another person, the most painful. I did not like it at all. And I felt like so many people raved about this book, and it made me want to find a book in which the main character has gone through trauma and overcomes it and becomes a better person, and you're just rooting for them. And that was not this book. Next up, I read The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd, and this is the first book I've ever read by her, but this book was so good. I know I just waxed poetic a few minutes ago about how much I love like feminist retellings of mythology, and while this one isn't mythology, it is a feminist retelling of the story of Jesus. So before anybody gets offended, the main character in this book is the wife of Jesus. And I wasn't sure when I started reading this book how they were going to handle the religious element of it. And to be honest, they don't really handle it in this book. The book is told entirely from Jesus's wife's perspective. Jesus's wife, her name is Anna. So this book is told entirely from Anna's perspective, starting out what leads her to meet Jesus, how she tries to escape from a marriage she doesn't want to be a part of. She just wants to read and write and be educated, and that's not something that her family or her society supports her in at the time. And so Jesus becomes a kind figure in her life who does support her, and they end up getting married through circumstances that I don't want to spoil for you. But so the book is told entirely from her perspective, and the relationships that she has with other characters from the Bible are very interesting. So for example, the character of Judas is actually her stepbrother, and she has an interesting relationship with Mary, and there are just a lot of really unique elements to the way the story is told. And the more like fantastical, religious, like spiritual things don't happen in this book, which is not to say that they don't exist in the book, but since it's not told from Jesus's perspective, and for large sections of the book Anna and Jesus are not physically together when these things happen, there's a lot of ambiguity, and so the book focuses so much more, it focuses really on just human Jesus, rather than Son of God Jesus. And it's such a unique perspective, and I really loved the story. I found myself rooting for her. It was 5 stars on Goodreads. I highly recommend it to anyone who likes retellings or feminist-leaning historical fiction. It was so good. Next up on my read list is the book Lie, Lie Again by Stacy Wise. This is another book I got from NetGalley. This was a decent book. My main problem with this book was that I felt like I got a different story than the one I was pitched. The description of the book kind of pitched it as it's like a murder mystery, or that there's some sort of thrilling aspect around the murder mystery, because in the very beginning of the book, you know, there's a murder. And all of these characters live in the same apartment complex. The murder happens in this apartment complex. And so you think that's really what's going to be the main part of the book, and it's not. I guess it would be like relationship fiction. It's about the relationships between the main female characters, between them and their love interests, or them and their work. It's a really interesting story. It has multiple main characters, multiple narrators, so if that's something you don't like, you probably wouldn't like this book, but if you do, then I would recommend picking it up. I feel like there's also a little bit of a potential romance angle pitched, and it's not really that either, so if you're interested in that type of book, that's not what this is. But if you just like hearing about the relationships between decently written female characters, I'd recommend you pick this up. You might like it. Up next on my list is another NetGalley book. This one is called Georgiana's Secret by Arlen Hawks. So this book was from NetGalley. It was pitched as a high seas romance in the sort of Regency period, early 1800s. I did not like this book. I gave it 2 stars. Honestly, I should have probably given it 1 star. It was painful to read. It wasn't enjoyably bad. The problem is that it was pitched as a romance book, and it just didn't feel like there was romance in it. So Georgiana is the main character, the titular Georgiana from the title. She is the daughter of the captain. She has to disguise herself as a boy, so she hides away on the ship as a cabin boy so she can be at sea with her father, because her mother is dead and her grandmother, who she was staying with, is abusive, and so she needs to be at sea with her father. And her love interest, whose name I don't even remember because I hated this book, is the first mate or first lieutenant or something like that. He's the second in command on the ship. He takes her under his wing as the cabin boy because he sees her getting like roughed up and picked on by the other characters, the other like cabin boys that she's with. And so he teaches her how to box. And I don't know what you guys think, but I feel like boxing and like self-defense, like it's very physical, obviously. And so I pictured there being a lot of tension in those scenes, and there just wasn't. There was no romantic connection whatsoever between these characters. There just wasn't. Like, they didn't interact a ton, and when they did interact, it wasn't romantic. It didn't feel good to read. Like, there was no tension. I wasn't rooting for these characters to develop a relationship, and it didn't really feel like one was there at all. And then, of course, he gets injured, and she helps save him. And it didn't even feel like there was romantic tension there, which I feel like is supposed to be the crux of a lot of romantic stories that use this kind of basic trope and plot structure. And it just wasn't there. And then they get married at the end, like in the epilogue. Like they don't date, they don't really share any romantic interactions. And then the epilogue just has them get married, and it was not very well done. The book, instead of featuring romantic interactions, focused a lot more on 19th century ships and 19th century sailing, and that just wasn't what I wanted to read. One of my main problems with this book was that I don't know who it was for. If you like a romance, that's not what this book is. Like, the plot of the book is supposed to be that, and it's just not, because the 2 characters don't really have much of a relationship. And it's not even a slow burn story. Like, they just don't really develop a relationship in the course of the book. And so that's not really appealing to somebody who's into romance. If you're into 19th century ships and 19th century sailing, you're not going to pick up this book because you're going to think it's a romance novel. And so I just don't really know what the author was going for. but I didn't care for it, and I didn't feel like it was pitched to an audience that would receive it well. Next up on my list is the book A Splendid Ruin by Megan Chance. So this book follows the main character, May, after her mom dies. She's from New York. Her mom dies. She's in her 20s, I believe. She doesn't know her father. She has no other family. So she gets a telegram, presumably, from her late mother's sister inviting her to move in with her aunt's family in San Francisco. And this all happens in 1906, so the earthquake is looming in the background. That was the thing that kept me most invested in the story, since I love historical fiction. I really wanted to know when the earthquake was going to come in and how that was going to play the part. My problem with this was that it was structured weirdly. So the book has 3 parts. The first part is her getting settled into her life in San Francisco. The middle part is the shortest part, and she's committed to an asylum. I didn't care for this part at all. I felt like it was very heavy-handed. It featured a lot of abuse of psychiatric patients, torture, really, which was just not what I had signed up to read. So that was really not what I thought this was going to be. And it was hard to read in parts, and not necessarily the most well or sensitively handled. Then the third part of this book is her, after she gets out of the asylum, trying to make her way in this newly ruined society and resolving the tension from the first part of the book. And this is weirdly the third book I've read now in a very short time period, like between March and April, where the main character is sent to an asylum against their will when they don't really need to be in one. And it's just weird that that's happened so many times to me recently, that I've found books that have that, especially with this one where it wasn't really advertised that that was a plot point. That's not really a trope I like. It's not really a setting that I find appealing. I find those books really hard to read because they can often be so brutal. I didn't care for this book a ton. I thought it was just an average book. From Goodreads, I got the sense that some people liked it, and so if you like historical fiction and you don't mind asylum settings, or you even like asylum settings, you might really like this book. Next up on this list is another book from NetGalley. I read The Watchmaker of Dachau by Carly Shabovsky. This book takes place during the Holocaust, which is not something that I read a lot of historical fiction about. And the reason for that is that I have researched the Holocaust from an academic perspective. And I don't really like fictional stories set during the Holocaust, because I've read so much survivor testimony and accounts about the Holocaust that to me it just seems like there is so much out there, there's so many individual experiences, that making a fictional story set in that time period is just superfluous. It's not necessary. Like, whatever you can make up, there's someone out there who's lived something very similar. And that's not me trying to say that it's problematic or anything like that, but I've read so many true accounts about it that the fictionalized versions don't really appeal to me. But I picked this one up from NetGalley, and it was very well written, I will say that. I was afraid it was going to be very similar to The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is a book that I read when I was in high school, and I hated it. I just found the characters very hard to connect to, and I just didn't like the way it was written. This has a similar element where one of the main characters is a little boy whose father is the commanding officer that oversees Dachau, which is their local concentration camp. And he interacts with the Jewish prisoners who come to the house to perform labor at the house from Dachau, the concentration camp. And he doesn't know what Dachau is or that it's right next to his house. And so he kind of tries to put those pieces together, and this is kind of set. Most of this book focuses heavily on the end of the war and how that plays out in regards to concentration camps like Dachau. This was a pretty decent book. If you like stories that focus on the Holocaust, you would probably love this. So anybody who reads stories set in that time period, I would recommend this one to you. The last book I read from the January to March time period is Confessions of a Curious Bookseller by Elizabeth Greene. I hated this book. I hated this book so much. I gave this book a 1-star review because it was horrible. It has most of the same problems that Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine has, except this book is worse. It's just poorly executed. The main characters in those books are virtually identical, except we don't even get a traumatic backstory about this one, the Curious Bookseller, Confessions of a Curious Bookseller. We don't even get her tragic backstory, really. She doesn't get along with her father, and it's not very elaborated on, and it's just not good. This book also has the weak point of being an epistolary novel, and I like epistolary novels, so that wasn't necessarily what killed it for me, but it's really confusing because a lot of the communications that are in the book are not letters. Like, some of them are emails, but it's very easy when you're reading to miss who's sending who an email. Sometimes it's like flyers or tweets or other promotional materials. And so the story isn't laid out. And since it's not someone writing to someone else where they're telling you the narrative, and so you as the reader are hearing what happens, you have to put together a lot of the pieces yourself. And the main character really doesn't make sense, so that's hard. Like, you can't fill in motivations for her that you would fill in for a regular person because she's so odd. She's also a very irresponsible cat owner, by the way. That really upset me. So anybody out there who has a cat, please be prepared to be outraged by her sheer audacity to think she is a good cat owner. So all in all, I hated that book. I hated it a lot. Definitely gave it a 1-star review on Goodreads. So this has been my January to March wrap up. I hope to make these videos more regularly and check in with you about what I'm reading. I'd also love to do TBR videos. Not that I'll be able to stick to them, not that anybody really sticks to their TBR, although if you do, I applaud you. But I hope to make more of these in the future and see how it goes. Thanks for watching.